Example 4 is already set up with 0 on one side of the equation, so we don't have to move things around like we had to do in example 3, where we had to start off and subtract x to get 0 on one side. We already have 0 here. So we are ready to jump in and go ahead and identify a as 3, the number in front of x squared, b as -4, that's the number in front of x, and then our c is 2, that's the number that has no x with it. I'm going to first calculate the discriminant of b squared minus 4ac. So I'll be squaring -4 and then subtracting 4 times 3 times 2. -4 squared is a positive 16, so we have 16 minus 4 times 3 times 2, which is 24. And 16 minus 24 is a -8, which is less than 0. So because that is less than 0, that tells us that this quadratic equation is going to have imaginary solutions. All of our solutions are going to be involving I. And I'll remind us that up here, where we talked about times where the discriminant was negative, we made the note that the square root of -1 is equal to I. I is an imaginary number. It's not a real number. We know that in the real number system, we cannot take the square root of -1 because we cannot find two numbers that are the same number that would multiply to give us -1. So I'll just remind us here that the square root of -1 is equal to I, and then we will proceed with the quadratic formula to solve this. So first I'll just set up the quadratic formula, and then we will go ahead and start plugging into it. And mind you that all of this is what x is equal to, the solutions for our equation that we're solving here. So now I'm going to plug in. So I have x is equal to, be careful with our signs, we have -b, and b is already a -4. So that is -4 plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac. So all of this we've already calculated, and we got -8 for it. And then in the denominator we have 2 times a, and a is 3. So continuing to simplify this, -4 gives us a +4, plus or minus. I'm going to go ahead and write the denominator. 2 times 3 is 6. Let's break down that square root of -8. First thing is, and I guess I'll break this down off to the side here. Because it is negative, I'm going to go ahead and just write it as the square root of -1 times 8. And then I can break that up into two separate square roots. So I know that I will definitely have an I in the problem because the square root of -1 is I by definition. So replacing this with I is just coming from that definition. Now let's talk about how we can simplify the square root of 8, because there is a perfect square that goes into 8. That perfect square is 2. So we can rewrite the square root of 8 as the square root of 4 times the square root of 2, and the square root of 4 is 2. So I'm not going to write I2 root 2 because that looks weird. I'm going to write 2I root 2. So we typically put any numbers that we have in front of that I. So we have just simplified the square root of -8 down to 2I root 2. And remember, not every square root can simplify. So sometimes, for instance, if we had like the square root of -15, we could still pull an I out of it because it is negative under that square root, but the square root of 15 cannot simplify. But every time you have a negative number under the square root, you will end up with an I in your answer. So now I'm going to replace that square root of -8 with 2I root 2. And now we can come back and finish simplifying our fraction because all 1, 2, 3 of those have a 2 in common. We can divide everything by 2. Notice that I'm not talking about the 2 that's under the square root because we cannot reach under that square root and simplify that. So dividing all of these by 2, we're left with 2 plus or minus I root 2 all over 3. I'm going to write this as two separate solutions just to emphasize that there are really two answers here. There's the first answer, and here is the second answer.